and to regard the extreme cases as outliers. In our analysis, we might even exclude them. If you take a longer view of economics, then this is not the case at all. The key, the big picture I try to get across is not to think about equilibrium thinking. I think maybe within, let's say, 10 years, and when we look back, we'll see that actually what we had was something extremely bad, again, which may seem obvious, but are important.
네, 전 세계의 현명한 구루들을 찾아서 그들의 의견과 그들의 인사이트를 들어보는 글로벌 머니톡, 날이 갈수록 인기를 더해가고 있는 글로벌 머니톡 시간을 경건한 마음으로 시작을 하겠습니다. 오늘도 함께해 주시는 분, 글로벌 머니톡의 기둥이죠. 중앙일보의 강남규 국제경제선임기자님 나오셨습니다. 어서
안녕하세요.
오세요.
한입 직함이 바뀌어가지고
네.
입에 한입 가득이죠.
그러니까 국제경제선임기자가 되셨습니까?
그렇죠. 사실 이제 우리 이 프로도 기자 출신이니까 기자는 많은 부서를 돌아다니지 않습니까?
예.
이제 한 부서에서 맡은 일로 그 길로 쭉 가라.
이제 다른
그게
부서
이제 조직의 명령이죠.
발령 안 해준다는
예.
의미가 선임기자입니까?
그렇죠. 선임 기자죠. 그러니까 스페셜리티를 가지고 이제 그 정도 됐으면 이제 쭉 가봐라.
빼박 국제경제. No way out.
그렇죠. 사실 무슨 그 국제경제 선임기자 개인적으로는 굉장히 좋아하는 직함이에요.
네.
왜 그러냐면은 부장, 국장 어떤 이렇게 그 후배 기자들이나 동료 선후배 기자들을 지휘 조정하는 그런 역할보다도 그 한 분야에서 전문성을 가지고 일을 할 수 있는 그런 직책을 원했으니까.
네.
사실은 많은 분들이 제가 얼굴이 후덕하다고 생각하시는데 성격은 빙퉁 맞았고 뭐가 나 있는데 그 바람에 잘 아시잖아요.
근데 그렇게 모난 성격으로 인터뷰를 이제 섭외를 하러 다니면 별별 방식의 노 땡큐가 많을 텐데 그때마다 어떻게 푸십니까? 욕을 하십니까? 아니면 어떡하죠? 괜찮으세요?
사실은 이제 우리 이제 충격요법이라는 게 있지 않습니까? 제가 이제 발가락과 발가락 사이에 신경종을 앓고 있거든요. 등산 다니면서 잘못 등산을 신었기 때문에 그 치료법 중에 하나가 거기를 체외 충격바로 계속 때리는 거예요. 그럼 나중에 되면은 고통을 못 느껴요.
신경을 죽여요?
왜?
신경 치료?
그렇죠. 그 신경 치료의 기본 컨셉은 계속 충격을 줘서 무디게 만드는 거죠. 그러니까 사실 계속 무수하게 우리가 이제 글로벌 머니톡을 한 1년 반 진행하면서 40여 명의 인터뷰를 해왔지 않습니까? 인터뷰를 초청을 해서 그 줌이라는 방식을 테크놀로지를 이용해서 우리 국내 투자자와 독자들에게 해외 전문가들이 인터뷰를 해왔는데 사실 그 정도 하는 과정에서 40여 명을 불러내기 위해서는 더 많은 숫자는 거절했겠죠. 거기에 마음에 상처받으면 아마 지금쯤 제가 좌절하고 어디 이렇게 정신과 치료를 받고 있겠죠. 그러나 이제
알겠습니다. 저희가 좀 더 열심히 만들어서 그 승률을 좀 높여드리겠습니다.
그렇죠.
자, 오늘 인터뷰 하실 대상은 어떤 분입니까?
저도 경제학을 공부를 했습니다만은 깊이는 아니지만 경제학을 했습니다만 경제학은 기본적으로 보편적 모델을 찾는 거거든요. 시간과 공간을 초월해서 적용할 수 있는 자본주의 시장 경제라면은 적용할 수 있는 모델을 만드는 게 이제 이코노미스트들의 일인데 그러다 보니까 이른바 예외 내지는 극단적인 사례는 전부 다 빼버리는 경우죠. 그런 일이 발생할 특히 그 계량 경제학 이코노메트릭스라는 그 기법을 경제학에서 본격적으로 활용하기 시작하면서 그 매트릭스라는 건 미터법이라는 그러니까 어떤 서양 음악에서 미터법 하면은 주제 리듬을 찾아내는 거지 않습니까? 그게 이제 경제하고 맞물려서 통계치에서 어떤 일정한 리듬을 찾아내는 행위. 그게 이코노메트릭스거든요. 통계학적을 이용해서. 그러다 보니까 예외 내지는 극단적인 상황, 우리가 이제 뭐 버블 이런 걸 갖다 비합리적인 극단적인 상황 이렇게 이제 가정을 하는데 그거보다는 이 리처드 데이비스 영국의 브리스톨대학과 LSE에서 강의를 하고 있는 리처드 데이비스 교수는 아예 극단적인 상황을 찾아갑니다. 그러니까 정부가 없는 것, 시장이 붕괴한 곳, 극단적인 노령화가 진행돼서 이 젊은이가 전혀 없는
네.
그런 곳, 그런 곳을 찾아가서 이 AI 그 다음에 어떤 빈부의 격차, 그 다음에 시장의 붕괴 등이 발생했던 그곳에서 어떻게 경제 활동이 부활해서 이어지는가를 살펴보는.
네.
그래서 말 그대로 극단적인 경제 전문가죠. 그래서 그 우리나라에서도 번역이 돼 있습니다. 2030년 극한 경제 시나리오.
번역되어 있는 책이에요.
그렇죠. 책
네.
제목으로는.
예.
그래서 지금 현재 많은 그 어떤 뭐랄까 미래, 그다음 인플레이션과 뭐 스태그플레이션, 그다음에 이 글로벌 공급망의 어떤 뭐랄까 병목 현상, 우리가 과거에 상상하지도 못했던 아니면은 뭐 그런 일이 일어나겠어라고 생각했던 현상이 우리 눈앞에 벌어지고 있지 않습니까?
그러나 일어나서 이제 우리의 숙제가
그렇죠.
되어버린 다양한 현상들,
예.
고령화, 공급 부족, 인플레이션 등등 다양한.
예. 한번 그래서 이제 인터뷰를 한번 이 여름에
그 각각의 주제에 대해서 어떻게 생각하는지.
예.
재밌을 것 같은데요.
자, 그러면
네.
인터뷰를 시작해 볼까요?
그러면 바로 질문 좀 드려보죠.
교수님, 사실 그 경제학 하면은 일반 룰을 찾아가는 거지 않습니까? 보편적인 법칙 내지는 어떤 뭐랄까 일정한 리듬을 찾아가는 게 경제학의 그동안의 연구 방법이었는데 어떻게 극단적인 경제를 바탕으로 경제를 분석하고 전망하기 시작했는지요?
You're right. You're 100% correct. So in modern economics, let's say since the kind of data revolution, which I would date back to work in the kind of 60s and 70s, when economists began to take their models and very rigorously compare them with data. Since then, the philosophy has been to look exactly as you say, to try and look at the normal, the average case, the median consumer or the representative household, and to regard the extreme cases as outliers. In our analysis, we might even exclude them, just drop them from our charts, from our tables, and so on. If you take a longer view of economics, and if you also take a longer view of science, then this is not the case at all. So to take science first, in the history of anatomy, so the understanding of the human body, to give one example, there's a very strong tradition of using out very single human beings, single cases that are very extreme to understand how the human body works. And there are some very famous cases of this that I mentioned in the start of the book. In particular, one in the UK, which was a young son of a nobleman, a very rich man in the UK, who had access to a superb doctor called William Harvey. He injured his chest, his front of his body, so badly that his heart, you could see his heart. And this doctor actually generated or proposed the modern understanding of exactly how the heart works from actually seeing this heart in this patient. Similarly, in the US, there's a very famous case which was written about by the late writer Oliver Sacks. He wrote about this a lot, and the patient was called Phineas Gage, Gage, and this was a guy who was working on a railroad, and he had an explosion put a piece of metal in his eye, and it separated his brain. And so again, a one-off case, but this helped us understand how the brain works. And you see this in engineering, where people are fascinated by the kind of one-off worst collapses of a bridge or explosions. You see, and historically, the classical economists used to do this. So, for example, would make a real in-depth study of things like the decline and the failure of cities. So a classic one would be the decline of Rome. Everyone used to study and really try and understand what happened in Rome. So I think in modern economics, we've lost this idea that we can learn from the extremes. And so that was my idea. So it's something that's still used in science, and it used to be used in economics. And my proposal is that we do a bit more of this extreme thinking in our current economics.
어떤 폭발 사고로 눈에 강철 조각이 박힌 사람의 사례를 분석해서 의사가 아주 극단적인 상황이죠.
네, 잘 벌어지지 않는
인체의 구조를 해명했던 그 방법론을 자기도 경제학에 한번 써보고 싶었다고 얘기를 하시네요.
예. 극단적인 상황을 관찰하다 보면 세상이 어떻게 돌아가는지에 대한 원리를 연역적으로 알 수 있는.
그렇죠.
알겠습니다. 저도 질문을 좀 같이 드려보죠. 교수님, 보통은 책을 쓰실 때 많은 분들이 나는 이 책을 통해서 이러한 결론과 이러한 레슨을 사람들에게, 독자들에게 주고 싶다라는 게 머릿속에 되게 이제 갖고 시작하실 텐데 이 책은 어떤 교훈을 미리 좀 생각하고 쓰셨습니까?
So the big lesson or the big picture that I'm hoping to get across with the book is two things. The first one is to try to clarify what I argue are the big challenges that will face all countries between now and 2013, 2040, really for the rest of my lifetime, and I think the rest of your lifetime and most of your viewers. And those three challenges I argue in the book are technology, the rise of the robots, the rise of automation. What does this mean for employment? What does it mean for wages? Inequality, which is rising very quickly, particularly in so-called emerging markets, and particularly in what we might think of as the most exciting emerging markets. So, 20 years ago, people regarded the big emerging markets as kind of China and India, let's say, Brazil maybe. But the emerging markets I'm thinking of is the kind of next wave of very exciting economies that people are talking about. So places like Nigeria, places like Kenya, South Africa, maybe the Philippines. So the sort of next generation of fast growing economies, they're becoming very, very, very unequal. The highest inequality we've ever seen. So that's the second challenge. And then the third challenge, which will be very, I think, the one that might be most familiar to your listeners, is the challenge of demographics. So the aging society, which is a function both of extended lifespan, which is a good thing from on its own, but also from a declining birth rate. And what that means is that the average age in many countries is going up very fast. So a big part of the book is to say, listen, there are lots of things we can talk about. There's the financial crisis, there's the rise of Bitcoin, we now have the pandemic. We now currently, as we're speaking, have a war going on in Ukraine. There are so many things. But these three things, I argue, are going to be the things that we will still be talking about in 2030. We will still be talking about in 2040. I hope we're not talking about pandemics then. I hope we're not talking about wars then. But these are long-run things that are going to affect all of us. So that's the first point and sort of lesson I want to get across with the book. And then the second one is to say, well, how can we analyze these things? How can we understand these things? And the key, the big picture I try to get across is and it goes back to your lessons that you're teaching that you had is not to think about equilibrium thinking and build a whole model of the whole world, and to think about ceteris paribus or other things equal and so on, but instead to travel and to travel to the places where these things are most extreme. And the reason to do that is something actually that John Maynard Keynes mentioned in an essay almost 100 years ago, which has been a little bit forgotten. Or the essay is famous. It's called Economic Possibilities for Our Children. And it's famous because he tried to do a 100-year prediction from 1930 to 2030. Within that essay, one of the things he said was, if we want to understand the future, we can essentially travel today to engage in time travel. And what he meant was, suppose there's a trend that we know is going to affect us all, let's say demographics. Rather than me in England trying to make a model of how is the UK economy going to age and how is this going to happen, rather than do that, simply, we know that we will become an older society, find a society that has already become older and go to that extreme. So that's the idea with the book. It's to find each trend or each problem and go to the extreme. And in this case, the aging extreme, actually, if I'd done the book, let's say in 10 years' time, I think I would have come to Korea. Actually, I went to Japan and to Akita because that's the prefecture where they have the oldest age group. So the idea is to go there, talk to people, understand life, interview many people from the elderly to the students to the politicians, and understand what we can learn. So that's the kind of idea behind the book and was the plan for the book.
참 리처드 데이비스 교수 같은 경우는 아주 흥미로운 말을 했습니다. 이제 우리가 흔히 말하는 경제는 늘 균형을 가정을 하지 않습니까?
그렇죠.
균형 상태를 가정하는 사고 방식을 버려라. 그러니까 에퀄리브리움이라고 얘기를 하는데 그 어떤 수요와 공급 내지는 1차 산업과 2차 산업, 3차 산업 그 사이에 재와 서비스의 총생산과 소비가 완벽하게 소화되고 재고가 남지 않은 내지는 그 시차가 발생할지라도 궁극적으로 균형을 이루는 그런 사고 방식을 이제는 좀 접어둬야지 그 제대로 된 미래의 경제상을 그릴 수 있다.
이례적 상황의 일상화를
그렇죠.
가정하라.
예.
네.
재밌죠. 교수님, 고령화 또는 노령화의 문제를 말씀하셔서 귀가 솔깃합니다. 사실 그 일본 못지않게 한국도 상당히 고령화가 빠르게 진행되고 있습니다. 출산율도 낮고요. 이런 상황을 어떻게 한국이 대처해야 할까요, 교수님?
So I'll give you a concrete example of that, and this applies to the UK, but I'm sure it applies to Korea and as well, but also to Japan. There's some concerns about, birth rates, why are people not having children and so on. I think these things are very, very deeply cultural. They're to do with the way we've become modern human beings. We don't want to have 8 children anymore, as we would in, similarly, I'm sure it's the same for you, but my grandparents and their parents, they would have 6, 7, 8 children. It was the same. If you look at the data, it was the same in Japan. It was the same in Korea. It was very common to have 5 or 6 kids. People don't want to do that anymore. And some of the ideas you sometimes see of, the government can make this change and everyone's going to start having kids. I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it, because these things are very deep personal choices. However, there are economic effects and we can seek to manage those. Japan's population has peaked and now is declining quite fast. This means we need more workers all the time, and particularly in things like care. And I spent a good few days visiting elderly care homes from places where you go, let's say when you're maybe 60, 70 and you're still, you can engage in games and play and so on, to places where you're very, very old, maybe 80, 90, and you're starting to lose your mental faculties a little bit. And there are technological solutions, from games to robots to simple cuddly toys that provide reactions. So, and you will have seen some of this stuff. That means that a single care worker can use this technology to help many, many more elderly people. So in the technical language of economics, we'd say it's labor augmenting. It kind of, for me as a worker, it makes my labor bigger. And now in a country like Japan, but also Italy, Spain, Korea, Estonia, many, many countries are over their peak, and their population is now, it's either peaked or it's starting to go down. The approach to technology is very different, and embracing that is a really key thing to do. So those are the kind of good stories. Technology is helping, innovation and entrepreneurship is helping, and so doing as much as you can to promote those is very important. The more worrying side, which is there, first, just an observation, is that I think across the world, but this may be a slight generalization, but I don't think it is, because I think it relates a little bit to the religious or like cultural beliefs. Some countries have a very, very strong vision of dynastic respect, let's say. So respect for one's father or one's grandfather, respect for one's mother, respect for one's parents. That's very strong in Japan. I know it's also very strong in Korea. Some countries have this cult, like Nigeria, for example. The grandmother is very, very strongly respected. Same in the UK. We respect our parents, we respect our grandparents, but I would say maybe not that real, very, very strong culture. And one of the things that's surprising, given that when you talk to young people in Japan, is the tension, the anger that is starting to build between the generations. So there are, I think, sort of jokes, I would say, unfriendly words, unfriendly jokes referring to old people, which young people will commonly say now. And in a place where traditionally the culture is to respect the elderly, the fact that the young are starting to make this is concerning, because the pension payments and the help for the elderly is so strong that the young feel that they're bearing this problem. And so the warning, I would guess, of the book is that we need policies to of course, to help the elderly, but to ensure that the young don't feel disenfranchised, annoyed, angry, and this respect between the ages doesn't break down.
우리는 고령화 하면은 노동시장에서 젊은 인력이 줄고,
그렇죠.
그래서 단가가 올라가고 임금이 상승하는 그런 상황을 가정을 하지 않습니까? 그래서 한국 기업들, 사실 고령화 문제에 대해서 여성단체나 진보단체보다도 기업들이 더 요즘 걱정하죠. 그런 이유. 근데 이 데이비스 교수 같은 경우는 고령화라고 해서 경제가 멈추지 않았더라. 현장을 가보니까 많은 젊은이들이, 그리고 상대적으로 젊은 노령화가 덜 된 노인들이 그 나이 든 노인들을 더 나이 먹은 노인들을 케어하는 그런 비즈니스가 충분히 시장이 형성되고 비즈니스 활동이 이루어지더라. 그리고 거기에 맞춰서 AI와 AI 등 첨단 기술을 활용한 그 어떤 뭐랄까 케어도 충분히 이루어지고 있더라, 현장에서. 그런 걸로 봐서 어떤 노령화가 경제의 종말 내지는 대단히 그 힘든 위기, 그거라고 보는 시각에 대해서는 동의하지 않는 것 같습니다.
고령층이 잘 케어되고 있는 거를,
그렇죠. 새로운 기회에, 그러니까 고령화는 또 하나의 경제적인 의미에서 기회일 수도 있다라는 거죠.
그분들이 이제 꾸준히 소비를 해준다면 큰 문제는 없을 것이다.
그렇죠.
생산에 직접 참여하지 않는 부분에 대해서는 아쉬움이 있을 텐데
있지만은 끊임없이 일자리를 창출하고 새로운 서비스, 새로운 시장을
만들어낸다는 차원에서
그 어떤 뭐랄까 비관적이지만
꼭 비관적으로만 볼 건 아니다.
예.
고령화되는 세대가 어떤 조건을 갖추면서 고령화되느냐에 따라 달려 있다는
그것도
뜻이죠.
중요하지만은 그 사실은 어디든지 사실은 다행스럽게도 지금 현재 고령화를 심각하게 앓고 있는 나라는 대부분 산업화가 굉장히 성숙한 나라거든요.
그렇죠.
일본에
그렇죠.
아프리카가 고령화 문제는 아니지 않습니까? 아직은
네, 예.
남미도 그렇고 그렇다면은 경제나 산업 구조가 어느 정도 산업 생산력 같은 게 어느 정도 그 올라 있는 나라에서 고령화가 발생하고 있는 거죠.
네.
그 점은 아무래도
다행일 수 있다.
다행일 수 있다.
선진국에서만 주로 발생하는 상황이니까.
그래.
네, 교수님 책에는 그 영국의 조선 산업의 중심지였다가 쇠퇴한 영국의 글래스고우 지역의 이야기가 나옵니다. 이게 아마 우리나라 조선 산업도 조만간 거쳐가게 될 그런 운명의 히스토리일 수도 있을 것 같은데 이런 흐름에 대해서 어떻게 좀 대응을 하고 저항을 해야 되겠습니까? 즉 산업 기반이 사라져버린 도시를 어떻게 우리는 케어하고 혹은 부활을 시도해야 되는지 거기에 대한 궁금함이 있습니다.
I'm glad you suggested that, and I'm glad that you kind of recognize the parallels. Glasgow is, let's say, the most kind of historical chapter in the book. And one of the reasons to do it was simply to raise global awareness, let's say, of what happened in that city. Some people know about cities, let's say, that have declined a little. One example that I think many people might know about is Detroit in the US and the kind of the problems that the motor car industry faced there and how that affected the city. But really, Glasgow, there is no other city that has faced such an extreme peak and then fall as Glasgow. And I think it's important for two reasons. First, we live in a world where people are increasingly based in cities. So everyone's moving to cities. And so in a sense, one way to understand economics these days is really to think about cities rather than to think necessarily about countries. So we are city dwellers in general. And then the second point is exactly as you say, many countries and many cities have a model, an economic model, which is focused on a number of key industries that city is then very well known for. And we can think of cities like that across the world. And it exists at different levels of technology, like for example, some of the, you mentioned some of the industries that large Korean cities are known for. But let's say in some of the cities in Bangladesh, there will be a very strong focus on the garment industry. So something that in the UK, places like Liverpool and Manchester would have done 100 years ago. So the industries are different, but this focus on a particular industry in a city is something that's very strong. Now, why is Glasgow important? Because 120 years ago, at the dawn of the 20th century, so as we moved from the 1800s into 1900, Glasgow was, and this surprises people, the hottest city, the coolest city, the best city on earth. Now, I don't know where you would say is that now. I'd say Seoul has a good shout. In the US, everyone loves Texas at the moment. Maybe Houston is the hottest city in the world. I'm not sure what it would be, but in the 1900, it was Glasgow. People from all over the world were moving there. It was kind of like Silicon Valley in some sense. One person wrote about it and called it the modern day Rome because it had art, it had theatre, it had culture, but it had this hugely strong sense of engineering and innovation that built up really around the shipping industry. And that city, Glasgow, was responsible for the world's first globalization. So many of your listeners will have heard of globalization and understand that we're globalized. But there was a kind of first globalization that happened in the 1800s up to about 1910. And that was basically because of Glasgow, because they built these huge ships that allowed us to move produce, commodities, from commodities to finished product to whatever it was, all around the world. And so the city grew hugely rich. And when you go there, you can see that the buildings are very, very grand. The main street, which is called Buchanan Street, because the buildings there were built in this period, they are more impressive, I would say, than the best streets in London, the best streets in, let's say, Oxford or Cambridge, because the city was so rich. And the risk was that this was based really around one industry at the core, and then a series of, some of them were mistakes to do with policy. Some of it was external competition from other countries. But essentially the city lost this key industry and didn't provide any mechanism for new industry to come in. And so suddenly it went from this haven, this amazing place, to being one of not just the UK's, but Europe's most troubled places. Very high unemployment, very high addiction to drugs, and very, very low. And then life expectancy, we talked about Japan, Korea, most countries, life expectancy shooting up. Life expectancy started to come down in Glasgow. And for working age men, at one point, it actually fell to about 55, which is kind of shockingly low for modern times. And so the lessons of Glasgow are, the first one is just be aware of the risk. So if you live in a city that you think, it's amazing here, we are the king of, let's say, semiconductors. Well, what happens when a lower cost country overseas suddenly develops their own technology and they start doing the semiconductors? What's the next plan? So the idea that you always have to have a plan to evolve and to upskill your industries is something that wasn't done in the UK, across the UK, and it particularly wasn't done in Glasgow.
네, 근데 바로 그 부분에서요, 교수님. 한국이 그럼 영국보다 미리 위기를 선제적으로 포착하고 선제적으로 대응하고 미리 준비를 해야 된다는 뜻인데 그게 잘 할 수 있을까요?
Very interesting. That's very interesting. And it's an interesting comment. I would say a couple of things on that, and particularly relating to the Korean example. I mean, the first one is that compared to the UK, Korea has had a very good, what you might call industrial strategy. Like the pace and the improvements and the stepping up the value chain in Korea, from the more basic manufacturing to high-tech manufacturing, has been, one, if not the best in the world, one of the best in the world. I think there are important lessons for people across the world from Korea. I guess the risk is that people kind of understand the model, and let's take an economy that I've mentioned a couple of times, Nigeria. Like that economy is going really strong now. Of course, they've got oil, so a lot of oil, and it's a little bit to do with that, but let's forget about that. A young population, increasingly educated, increasingly ambitious. It's not increasingly able to attract capital, connected with well connected. It wouldn't be crazy to think that in 20, 30 years' time, countries like that start to adopt large scale manufacturing in the way Korea has. So everyone is going to face a competitor, is what I'm saying. So on the one hand, I don't think it's necessarily bad In fact, I don't think it's bad at all that the business interests are reflected in politics, because at the end of the day, the businesses do the employment. You know, not everyone can work for the government, and so business should have a voice. The problem is that when the role of the politician is to be long-term vision, to think about everybody. The role of the business leader is to think about the shareholders for that particular business, and so you potentially have a tension there.
외국 전문가들에게 한국을 물어보면 약간
네.
좀 굉장히 좀 밝은 진단과 전망이 나올 때가 있습니다. 우리가 생각하는 것보다.
대체로 그렇더군요.
대체로
그래서
그렇죠.
그냥 그 예의 바른 인터뷰이라서 그러신가 보다 하는 생각들을 주로 하는데 안 그렇습니까?
실제로 저도 이제 외국에서 학교를 다녀봤기 때문에 경제 발전이라는 과목, 경제 발전론 같은 과목을 듣다 보면은
네.
한국이 굉장히 많은 예로 나오거든요. 근데 그 대목에서 이제 우리는 정말 지지고 볶고 가난과 싸우고 내지는 계층 간의 갈등이 심하고 정치 세력 간에 무슨 심각한 충돌이 발생하고 그다음에 어떤 세대 간의 갈등 뭐 여러 가지 우리 너무나도 구체적이지 않습니까?
예.
우리가 우리 자신을 보는 삶은. 그러나 그 서구인들의 눈에 한국은 놀라운 점이 하나 있습니다. 이 국가가 중심이 된 산업 전략을 펼쳐서 성공적으로 이 현재 한국의 산업 경제를 일구었다는 점. 이게 어떤 뭐랄까 시장의 자발적인 어떤 결과가 아니고 자체적인 결과가 아니고 정부가 앞장서서 인프라를 깔고 심지어는 우리가 한때 구조조정이라고 했지만 그 이전에는 산업 합리화라고 그래가지고 기업 간의 인수합병을 정부가 주도해서
그랬었죠.
한국은행이 나서서 특용을 줘서 인수합병 시켜서
네.
공급 과잉을 해소하고 막 그랬지 않습니까? 1980년대 초반에.
네. 예.
그런 어떤 뭐랄까 그 이전에는 또 무슨 중공업 중화학공업 육성 정책 이런 정책을 통해서 산업화를 다 이루고 그 다음에 구조조정도 정부가 주도를 해봤고 이런 과정을 거쳐서 현재 이르렀는데 그렇다면 그런 능력에 비춰서 이게 수학적 기납법이죠. 그러니까 뭐 A가 B를 낳고 B가 C를 낳았다면 C는 D와 D로 이어질 수 있다라는
예.
어떤 기납법적인 사고 방식일 수도 있는데 지금까지 한국이 이러이러한데 성공사를 해왔기 때문에 조선업이 휘청거리더라도 그 위기를 미리 대응하고 포착하고 대응할 수 있을 것이다.
한국은 그런 거 잘하더라.
예. 정말 그런가요? 2% 우리가?
하여튼 연구 대상이긴 해요. 제가 생각해도 코리아는
그렇죠.
그 정통 경제학에서 좀 다른 그 혁신이 중요하다, 교육이 중요하다라는 그 슌페터류의 주장이 있지 않습니까?
네, 그렇죠.
그 주장은 정통 경제학, 거시 경제학으로는 설명할 수 없는 결과가 자꾸 나오기 때문에 그런데 예, 그런 곳에서 가장 대표적인 사례로 드는 게 사우스 코리아의 사례들이죠.
한국 자체가 혹시 극단의 경제 그러니까
그렇죠.
예시일 것 같습니다.
네.
사실 교수님 아까 이제 국가 역할, 한국 정부 역할에 대해서 말씀을 하셔서 이 극단의 경제, 소위 이른바 아주 예외적인 경제 상황을 타개하기 위해서 국가와 기업, 사실 이 서방에서는 굉장히 그 어떤 대립적으로 보는 경향이 있는데 국가와 기업의 어떤 관계는 어떻게 설정을 해야 할까요?
This is a great question. I think my starting point on this is to mention something again that I have already mentioned, which is that we need technology. And the reason we need technology is because the human population is going to peak and it is going to then shrink. And as it shrinks, we will face a situation where there's more old people than young people. And we'll need to look after those old people. So we need more labor power to do that. And one of the things technology can do is to augment labor. So we need technology. That's my starting point. Second idea, and I like the way you put it, is that I don't think that the model that we have, I would say particularly in the UK, and also particularly now in the US, increasingly in the US, isn't necessarily the right one, because it is very antagonistic. It's the idea that essentially the government will set some rules. So the government sees itself as the rule setter. You can do this, you can't do this. And then the technology companies will invent things, and they see it as their role to kind of sometimes break the rules a little bit. Facebook famously said, move fast and break things. And that's the kind of thing that people in tech kind of say all the time. So some breaking of the rules might be okay if we develop new technology, I guess, would be the philosophy. That's one model. And so you increasingly see the big tech companies being taken in front of the government, put on trial, new rules and regulations and so on. And so it's fundamentally an antagonistic relationship. That's one way of operating. Another way of operating, and the one that I talk about at length in the book, is the one that's been adopted by Estonia, which I think is one that actually many countries are now seeking to follow. And I know there's some similar, not identical work being done in Korea. But the idea there is that the government is the kind of foundation or the base level investor. And so in Estonia, what the government has done is paid for and built this thing which is called the X road. So X road. And the way to think about it is it's a bit like a kind of nervous system or a backbone for human skeleton, let's say, and it kind of fits, all the bits fit onto it. And so companies can use this thing. It's a way to exchange information, essentially, in a decentralized way. So it has a kind of similarity to blockchain, but it's not exactly the same. But it's a way to manage, protect, exchange, make efficient, make fast, the exchange, the use of information. And information technology is the core of this revolution. And so they've built this thing, this foundation or this backbone that the private sector, the markets, can then add to and build on top of it. It's been hugely successful and led to two things. The first is a massive improvement in the provision of government services. So government has improved hugely in Estonia. And the second is that it has made Tallinn to a great extent, and also Tartu, the kind of second city, hubs for digital startups. They have a huge scene there of technology startups. So from Skype is the famous one, but lots and lots of others. It's a great example of governments and the private sector working together. And to just give one example to show what I'm talking about and the difference, in the UK, I would say, and I think also in the US, let's suppose you have a health system which connects hospitals. So doctors can connect to hospitals and so on. The natural approach in the UK would be to say, listen, this is very private. It's to do with our health. It must be private. So we're going to keep this system completely separate. What they've done in Estonia, because they use this X-road thing, is they say, listen, the information is private, but the connections between this hospital and this doctor, the funnels, let's say like the pipes, the data pipes, we can make anyone use those. We can let anyone use those. And so what that means is they have a whole raft, a whole list of companies that are sort of essentially health data apps and data management and new little devices like that you can wear on your arm, and it shares your data with your doctor, that run on those rails that the government built. It doesn't mean that the technology guys get access to all your private health data. It just means they're using the same system. And so it's fundamentally, I would say, cooperative system that involves government investment, but then big private sector investment on top of it, rather than this kind of fighting rules versus rule breaking or antagonistic approach that we see, I think, very often in the UK and US at the moment.
저기 데이비스 교수 같은 경우가 이제 에스토니아가 정보 인프라를 깔아서 그걸 이제 일반 스타트업들이 공동으로 활용할 수 있는 인프라를 깔아놓은 사업, 그 사업을 이제 예를 들었는데
유명하죠. 유럽의 판교.
예. 근데 사실 그 한국이 제일 먼저 한국이 사실 1960년대서부터 해왔지 않습니까?
새마을운동?
새마을운동이 아니고 경부고속도로 깔고 각종 인프라 깔고 그다음에 정보 인프라 깔아주고
초고속 인터넷.
그렇죠.
정부가 먼저 깔아줬죠. 뭐든지.
사실 그 사회적 비용으로 기업들의 영리 활동을 도와주는 꼴이었죠, 사실은.
그렇죠. 시비 걸기 시작하면 논란거리죠.
서구 역사에서 보면은 대단히 저기 한국 기업들은 특혜를 받고 국제 경쟁 시장에 이제 나서는 그런 사례였는데 그런 역할로 봐서 무슨 뭐 국가가 너무 규제가 강하다 내지는 규제만 한다 내지는 자기들의 공무원들의 어떤 이익을 사수하기 위해서 규제를 강화하는 편이 이런 식의 서구적인 이야기 영미 쪽의 이야기는 사실은 그 바람직한 접근법은 아니다라고 말씀하셨네.
네, 각자의 상황이 있다.
네.
저도 한 가지 최근에 마무리 국면인지 아니면 다시 커지는지 모르겠습니다만 팬데믹이라고 하는 사건이 인류의 경제사에서 꽤 큰 의미 있는 사건으로 아마 미래에도 자리를 잡을 것 같은데 예외적인 상황에 대해서 전문적으로 연구하는 경제학자로서 최근에 이 팬데믹, 인류가 거쳐온 코로나 바이러스로 인한 팬데믹 상황이 장기적으로는 어떤 영향을 주고 어떤 의미를 가질 걸로 보십니까?
This is obviously the question that we all face at the moment. The first thing to say is that it's very difficult while you're living through a shock. I would say we still are in the shock of the pandemic to conclude, what are the lessons going to be? But I would just suggest to you and your listeners and viewers the idea that often our first reaction is the wrong one. And just so one example of this would be COVID has been very, very bad. It's been a very bad thing. It's killed millions of people. It's undermined the employment of many more millions. It's completely torn up people's plans that they had over the past couple of years, prevented them from seeing their families. So it's a very, very bad thing. What that can lead to, I think, is a pessimistic, angry, which is understandable, a kind of angry, downbeat, pessimistic, low view of how we managed the pandemic. And that applies to both companies and to governments. We've seen this across the world. The UK government's made a lot of mistakes. The US, did we do the masks quickly enough? Didn't we do the masks quickly enough? People providing the vaccines. One batch we had here in the UK that was produced in India, it didn't work properly. One batch of tests rather than the vaccines. And so there's anger that people made these mistakes along the way. I think maybe we're in, let's say, 10 years, and when we look back, we'll see that actually what we had was something extremely bad. And what we managed to do was come up with a vaccine and vaccinate a vast majority of people at the moment in advanced countries, but it is picking up in developing countries as well, incredibly quickly and incredibly cheaply. And that was done by a combination of governments working with big pharmaceutical companies. I tend to think that in a few years' time, we'll look back and say, as a whole, the thing was bad. but that's because the starting point was really bad. And I think that governments and markets actually work together to make things quite a lot better. So I would be kind of quite optimistic. Ongoing changes, though, which is more the core of your question, is to try and make so I think the performance, what we've done, I'm a bit more optimistic than some. But the key is to make the change, the lasting change, be something that's good. The upside is that we've seen rapid improvements in how we do medicine, which is hugely important. Everyone has in their family somebody they know who is ill who has been ill. It's something that happens to all of us. And so the development of vaccines and treatments and the investment in science, I think, that will flow because of this is a very good thing. Some of the technological benefits that we have. So a simple thing, and I'm sure this is the same in Korea, is that in the UK we've all become very, very used to scanning things and barcodes on our phones, access to things, information. So we've jumped forward in our ability to use apps and to use technology, I would say 5-10 years, and that's a good thing. So to embrace, another key one is what we're doing now, you and I are doing now, is there's been a big jump in the way that we are communicating, particularly using video conferencing, which as an economy, like that's a nice thing to do, of course, but how does it help the economy? Well, what it does is it dissolves the nature of distance. So what you and I are doing right now has taken what for thousands of years is a fundamental problem, which is the fact that Seoul is thousands of miles away from London, and it's made us, UK and Korea, we can just talk. So these are amazing things that if our grandparents or great-grandparents could see them, they would say, wow, this is incredible. This is unbelievable. That's the good side. The downside is that, and I do think it was necessary, a strong role for government in exactly overseeing what we were doing, where we were going, scanning our movements, all those kinds of things, to lesser and greater degree in different countries, but all countries have done it. Even the most liberal countries have had things where, I just go into a building and I have to give my name and my number and my ID and all this kind of stuff. As a liberal person, and this is coming now to sort of my own philosophy, which is a bit different, but as a liberal, I don't want to see that as an echo of the crisis, because that kind of information typically in many, many countries across the world is still used to a detrimental effect, because governments become tempted to use it to track for their own political purposes rather than for health purposes. So in extreme circumstances, I think it was justified because of the extreme health. But we don't want to see a situation in which all our phones are constantly being tracked to tell governments where we're going, next year and the year after and so on.
사실 그 서구인들이 그 개인의 정보를, 그러니까 우리가 이제 어떤 뭐랄까 그 확진자를 추적하고 동선을 확인하고 하는 그 작업은 심각한 자유주의 전통에 따르면 그건 정말 전체주의 국가의 거겠죠. 그런데 전염병 때문에 그런 어떤 뭐랄까 서베일런스라 그러죠. 사회 구성원들의 어떤 행동을 어느 정도까지는 관찰하고 모니터하는 게 그런 기술의 발달이 되는 게 불가피한, 그러니까 현실적으로 피할 수 없는 일로 인정되는 계기가 될 수 있다. 계기가 팬데믹 때문에 그런 일상화되는 것을 용인하게 될 수도 있다. 그런 정도 선에서 말씀하시는 것 같습니다.
미국과 유럽의 전형적인 방식에 대한 의문, 실패가 논의되는 계기가 됐다.
그렇죠. 교수님, 그 저서의 한국어판 제목이 2030년 극한의 경제 시나리오입니다. 자, 우리가 이제 이 삼프로와 중앙일보 구독자와 독자분들에게 실용적인 정보를 좀 드리기 위해서 한 가지 반드시 여쭤봐야 될 질문이 있습니다. 극단의 경제에 대한 분석을 바탕으로 앞으로 투자자가 장기적인 관점에서 어디에 내지는 어느 방향으로 투자를 하는 게 좋을 것 같습니까?
It's a really good question, and no, I don't get this. I haven't had this question, but I will answer it. I don't like it when people avoid questions. So let me go through some things. What you want to do is to spot a long-term trend. So what are the long-term trends? So some things that we can say again, which may seem obvious, but are important. And I don't think people are thinking of this yet. House prices are fundamentally to do with the amount of land, the amount of houses, and the number of people. In many countries, Japan is a great example, Korea is another great example, UK is another great example, US is not such a good example. Many European countries, let's say Italy is another great example. Just think of those countries I've mentioned, Japan, Korea, Italy, UK. It's quite clear that the land mass is fixed. There's a lot of sea all around. Even the ones that aren't fully an island, they're a peninsula, like Italy and Korea. There's no more land. There's no more space to build houses, and population has been going up. So the real value, taking away inflation, of property has essentially gone up and up and up and up and up for 100 years. When population starts to come down, house prices will start to come down, and you've seen that in a huge way in Japan. And I know the trend has taken, particularly in some Korean villages and smaller areas where people are moving to the cities as well. So this idea that lots of us have that real estate is a one-way bet, like real estate, over the long term, it always goes up. At some point, it will turn and start to come down. And you want to be very, very careful of that, particularly if you're taking out a big loan against the house. If the value of the house is going to go down, then the loan is going to suddenly become very, very hard to repay. So be careful on real estate. Now, don't trade too much. That's my first thing. Be careful on real estate. I personally would invest in a portfolio, if I could find one, a portfolio of companies that provide services to the elderly. This goes back to what I was discussing about demographics. The elderly population is growing. They have different tastes, as I mentioned, different types of golf clubs, different types of cars that are adjusted for the elderly, different types of technology, iPads that have much bigger buttons and so on. All of this stuff is combined with the fact that in many countries, that generation is actually a very wealthy generation. We often talk of the downsides. They need care, they need pensions and so on. Many of them are very, very wealthy and have money to spend and will spend that money. And so, yeah, if I could find a startup or a portfolio of companies that provide services to that group, because I know that group is going to grow and I know they're going to spend a lot of money, I would invest in that. And then the final one would be, my fourth and final one would be what's called the frontier economies. And by investors, your viewers can look that up if they want to. So what I'm talking about here again is emerging markets, and moving from the, let's say, 15 years ago view of emerging markets, where the terminology people often said was BRICS, say Brazil, Russia, India, China. That term was invented by a good contact and friend of mine, Jim O'Neill, at Goldman Sachs, because those were the most exciting markets. Those are not now the most exciting markets. It's places like some of the South American countries, I'd say Peru, Indonesia, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on. And those places, because they have in general have young populations, are adopting technology very quickly, are growing very quickly, and those are going to be good places to invest. With the slight warning, not the slight warning, the check, which is my point about inequality, which is that when you have very, very high inequality, which some of those places have, that is starting to lead to public anger, rioting, and those kind of things, as we've seen in Chile. And that kind of thing clearly is going to then damage an economy and damage investments that are made there. So, invest in these new, young, exciting economies, but be careful of inequality. But look, this is just what I would do. This is not investment advice. I'm an econ professor. I'm not a finance professor. Your readers take that as they wish.
일관되게 아마 눈치채셨을 텐데
네.
데이비스 교수 같은 경우는 이 노령화 때문에 발생하는 서비스업 내지는 그 신기술
노인들에게 뭔가 서비스를 제공하는 영역은 제가 생각해도 무주공산이에요. 특히 우리나라는.
그렇죠.
아무런 서비스가 없습니다.
아 그래요?
네. 아마 늙어보시면 아실 겁니다. 진짜 나를 위한 서비스를 하나도 없구나.
아 그렇다면 스타트업을
네.
지금부터 차려야 되는 거예요?
예, 저는 매우 특히 한국의 경우는 매우 유망하다고 봅니다.
그다음에 두 번째는 짐 오닐 과거에 골드만삭스입니까? 거기에 고위 관계자가 썼던 프론티어 마켓.
네.
브릭스를 대신해서 페루, 인도네시아, 나이지리아, 케냐 이 아주 젊은 세대가 많은 나라.
젊은 인구 많은.
그렇죠. 이 나라를 주목해야 된다.
예.
새로운 용어가 만들어질 법하겠는데요.
그러네요. 젊은 인구도 많고 인구의 절대 규모도 좀 있어야 되고.
그렇죠.
언급해주신 네 나라가 다 그렇죠. 예.
어떤 브릭스나
그런 나라에 투자해야 된다.
네, 그렇죠. 브릭스를 대신해서 새로운 변방에 있는 새로운 어떤 뭐랄까 미개척지, 개척지.
그 말을 뒤집어 말하면 이 고령화라고 하는 게 경제에 미치는 둔화 요소로는 피할 수 없다.
그렇죠.
그 말인 것 같아요. 그렇죠.
예. 사실은 제가 이제 공부할 때 들었던 강의 중에 하나가 노령화 때문에 빚어지는 중앙은행의 무력화. 왜 그러냐면 지금 사실은 많은 사람들이 빚이 많기 때문에 심각하다. 이건 사실 윤리적인 관점에서 얘기한 거고요. 경제학에서는 빚 때문에 통화 정책이 먹히는 거거든요. 그러니까 기준금리를 올리면 빚을 줄여서 총수요를 억제를 하고.
그리고 누군가의 빚은 누군가에는 에셋이니까요.
그렇죠. 그런 측면에서 빚은 통화 정책이 일상 경제 영역에 영향을 미치도록 하는 어떤 매개체거든요. 네. 근데 노령화는 나이 든 분들은 빚을 내기를 두려워합니다.
그러겠죠.
다른 말로 말한다라면은 어떤 현금 자기 자산 내지는 지금 현재 현찰에 의존하는 소비 활동이 더 많아지기 때문에 중앙은행이 기준금리를 조절하는 방식으로 실물 경제를 조절하는 응답 속도가
낮겠죠.
그걸 연구하시는 분들이 있습니다.
고령화는 그러니까 이러나 저러나 쉽지 않은 숙제인 거예요.
그렇죠.
풀기가 어렵고
네.
가만히 놔두면 또 통화량이 감소할 수밖에 없는 그런 구조인데.
교수님, 장시간 인터뷰에 감사드립니다.
고맙습니다.
예.
네, 오늘도 인터뷰 재밌었어요. 강 기자님께서는 어떤 대목이 좀 신선하게 들리셨습니까? 원래 이런 대화를 나누는 목적은 내가 알고 있는 것에 대한 재확인이 아니라 내가 간과하고 있었던 것 또는 내가 다르게 알고 있었던 것에 대한 새로운 해답 내지는 새로운 접근법을 배우는 재미인 거죠.
그렇죠. 근데 이제 이론 경제학을 맛본 저로서는 아까 처음에 말씀드린 데이비스 교수가 일본의 이제 동북면 쪽이죠. 저쪽 아키타현 사실 산골이거든요. 거기에 극단적인 노령화, 뭐 전체 인구에서 거주 인구의 90%가 70세 이상인 사람들, 이런 노령화 현장을 직접 찾아가서 그 속에서 그러면은 시장이 붕괴했느냐, 경제 활동이 멈췄느냐, 아니면은 거기에는 전혀 어떤 뭐랄까 기업이 전혀 투자를 하지 않았느냐, 뭐 이런 실태를 조사를 해본 결과를 얘기를 했거든요. 그런 측면에서 사실은 교과서 내지는 수상적인 모델만을 봤던 그 뭐랄까 이 경제학과는 달리 정말 생생한 사례를 들을 수 있었습니다. 그 점이 사실 좀 저에게는 신선했고요.
다음 인터뷰는 예정되어 있는 분이 계십니까?
지금 그 우크라이나 사태에 그 어떤 전쟁 전문가를 좀 초대를 해볼 예정입니다. 로런스 프리드먼이라고 영국에서 자기를 받은 그 킹스 칼리지의 전쟁 센터의 센터장이면서 전쟁의 역사에 대해서는 전쟁의 역사를 통해서 과거 미래를 비춰보는 책을 여러 권 썼죠. 그런 로런스 프리드먼을 통해서 우크라이나 사태, 그리고 블라디미르 푸틴 러시아 대통령의 어떤 뭐랄까 미래에 대해서
매우 궁금하죠.
예, 한번 물어보겠습니다.
네. 그 결과에 따라서 앞으로 뭐 에너지 시장도 많이 바뀔 거고.
아, 그렇죠.
굉장히 중요한 질문인데
예.
그 전문가분이 계셨네요.
예.
사실상 푸틴을 인터뷰하는 것보다 더 정확한.
사실은 푸틴은 이제 이해 당사자니까.
그렇기도 하고. 푸틴도 스스로 어떻게 해야 될지 모를 거예요.
아, 그렇죠.
네.
전쟁은 너무나도
누가
아무도
어떻게 전망하는지를
예측할 수 없는, 심지어는 거기에 뛰어들어서 싸우고 있는 장군과 군사령관 내지는 대통령까지도
네.
예측하지 못하는 방향으로 가고 있습니다.
예, 인간이 하는 대부분의 일들이 뭐 그렇기도 하죠.
예.
예, 다음 인터뷰도 기대되네요. 오늘 글로벌 모니터 여기서 마무리하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.